The night the Earl of Harrow struck the bargain that would change his life, a storm prowled across the London sky. Wind clawed at the windows of his study, rattling the panes like an impatient creditor demanding entry. He sat at the great oak desk, candlelight flickering over a ledger crowded with red ink. Beside it lay a single sheet of parchment, freshly sealed with wax, and a pen that trembled faintly in his hand, though his expression remained composed. Outside, the carriage wheels of departing guests splashed through the rain, carrying away the last of the men who had wagered against him that evening. He had lost more than he could afford. The ink dried black and final across the page, his signature bold and precise beneath the words that sold his future. 2 days earlier, he had been merely a proud but weary nobleman, watching his inheritance crumble under the weight of debts not his own. Now he was a man bound by a contract that promised salvation in exchange for something he had never valued: his freedom to choose whom to love. In the winter of 1832, the Earl of Harrow was 31 years old, solitary, disciplined, and utterly unprepared for what desperation could make him do. His father's estate lay mortgaged to the edge of ruin, his tenants restless, his creditors relentless. Reputation meant everything in society, and ruin would destroy not only his name but the lives dependent upon him. Marriage, he told himself, was a business transaction, nothing more. Emotion was costly, alliance was profitable. He needed wealth, and swiftly. Lady Eliza Whitmore, only daughter of a merchant recently elevated to the fringes of gentility, was the answer whispered by London's drawing rooms. Her father possessed a fortune built on trade and a hunger for respectability. A title for gold for survival. Each side would gain what it lacked. The arrangement was inevitable. He met the merchant in a private room above a club on James Street. The air smelled of smoke and polished leather, and the conversation was brisk, stripped of sentiment. Terms were set: a substantial dowry, prompt marriage, quiet discretion. The Earl read each clause carefully, his mind a tangle of pride and necessity. When he reached the line naming the bride, he hesitated only long enough to remind himself that names mattered little in such affairs. He signed, the nib biting through the paper, sealing his fate as efficiently as any auctioneer's gavel. That night, when he returned to Harrow House, the storm was already gathering. He poured himself a glass of brandy and stared into the fire, wondering at the strange stillness that followed his decision. He had expected triumph, relief, perhaps shame. Instead, he felt nothing at all, only the faint echo of thunder rolling through his chest. The next morning, the Earl's solicitor delivered a letter confirming the engagement. It would be announced within the week, and the wedding arranged soon after. Society would murmur, of course. It always did. But wealth silenced ridicule faster than virtue ever could. In those same days, Lady Eliza prepared herself with quiet obedience. She had never met the Earl, only heard that he was proud, reserved, and widowed too young by grief that had hardened into reputation. Her father's insistence that she accept the proposal left little room for resistance. A daughter's duty was to secure the family's standing, and she had been raised to understand that duty and happiness were rarely the same thing. On the morning they were introduced, snow drifted over the streets of Mayfair. The Earl arrived at the Whitmore residence dressed impeccably, his dark coat cutting through the pale light like ink across parchment. Eliza curtsied. He bowed. Their conversation lasted less than half an hour. He spoke with calm civility, his words precise and cool. She answered with politeness so measured it might have been written into the contract itself. When he departed, she watched from the window as his carriage rolled away, and the first fragile thread of unease tightened in her chest. He told himself she would do well enough. She was modest, quiet, unremarkably pretty, in a way that would not distract him from the work of restoring his estate. He needed a partner in appearance only, a lady who would host dinners, bear children, and keep her heart separate from his affairs. He had no use for affection. Affection complicated clarity. Yet that evening, as the snow thickened and silence settled over Harrow House, he found himself thinking of the way she had folded her hands when she spoke, the steadiness in her eyes, the faint tremor in her voice when she said, "I understand, my lord." The words had been ordinary, yet something within them had lingered. He dismissed the thought, turned back to his ledgers, and forced himself to believe that all he sought was restoration of balance. Love, he reasoned, was an extravagance reserved for men who could afford to lose. But the storm outside refused to quiet, and neither did the faint disquiet in his chest. The candle burned low, the ink dried, and in the restless hours before dawn, the Earl of Harrow realized that he had bound his life to a stranger. Somewhere in the city, she was preparing to become his salvation, unaware that she had been chosen not for who she was, but for what she could provide. He closed his eyes, listening to the wind rattle the windows again, and wondered without knowing why whether she liked the sound of rain. Before our tale unfolds and the marriage born of convenience begins its slow transformation, subscribe to the channel so you will not miss the next chapter, and tell us in the comments, do you believe affection can ever grow from obligation? The announcement of the engagement between the Earl of Harrow and Lady Eliza Whitmore stirred society like a spoon through still water. It was received with equal parts fascination and relief fascination, because the Earl, so long regarded as unapproachable, had at last chosen a bride. His relief because the union promised the blending of old title and new wealth, a restoration of balance in a world built upon appearances. Invitations followed swiftly, and within a fortnight, the Whitmore townhouse glittered with the light of chandeliers and the hum of polite curiosity. Eliza stood at the edge of the drawing-room, her hands clasped before her, every gesture measured, every smile practiced. The gown her father had chosen shimmered faintly beneath the golden sconces, its pale blue silk catching the light like frost on a window pane. She heard her name whispered behind fans, the murmur of speculation about the merchant's daughter soon to become a countess. She tried to quiet the tremor in her chest by repeating her father's words. This was security, this was respectability, this was what she had been raised to accomplish. When the Earl entered, conversation faltered for a moment, as if the very air acknowledged his presence. He was not conventionally handsome, yet there was an undeniable gravity about him, a calm authority that drew and unsettled in equal measure. His dark hair was brushed neatly back, his cravat precisely tied, his expression unreadable. He bowed to her father with the correctness of a man fulfilling his end of a bargain, then turned toward her. Their eyes met for the first time beneath the crystal glow of the chandeliers. For the briefest instant, she forgot her rehearsed smile. There was nothing cruel in his gaze, nothing warm either, only distance, as if he stood behind invisible glass. He offered his hand. She placed hers upon it, feeling the faint chill of his skin through the thin lace of her glove. "Lady Eliza," he said quietly, his tone courteous but without inflection. "My lord." Her curtsy was flawless. The moment passed like a breath held and released. They moved together toward the awaiting guests, greeted well-wishers, and accepted the subtle scrutiny of every glance. To onlookers, they were the image of composure, the nobleman reclaiming his fortune through alliance, the merchant's daughter ascending to grace. Yet within Eliza, a strange hollowness settled, a sense of standing on a precipice without knowing what lay below. During supper, he spoke sparingly, asking after her health, her preferences, her music, his questions polite but mechanical, as though dictated by etiquette rather than curiosity. She answered softly. Each word weighed before it left her lips. When he mentioned Harrow Hall, she listened with interest, imagining the great estate she would soon call home, its gardens, its galleries, its silence. He did not notice the warmth in her expression. His attention drifted to the cutlery, the placement of crystal, the necessary performance of civility. Later, when music began in the adjoining salon, he offered his arm. They danced a single set, a waltz measured and distant, their movements graceful yet without rhythm of shared intent. Around them, other couples glided with laughter and whisper, but between them lingered only the faint rustle of silk and the echo of the orchestra. Eliza tried to speak once, to ask whether he preferred the country or the city, but his reply was so brief, the country for its quiet, that she hesitated to continue. She smiled anyway, as she had been taught, and told herself that silence could be a kind of gentleness. Yet even then she sensed the weight of his reserve, as though he had sealed himself behind the same parchment that bound them together. When the evening drew to its close, he escorted her to her father, bowed again, and prepared to depart. "Our wedding will be soon," he said with calm finality. "My solicitor will communicate the details. I hope the arrangements will not trouble you." "Company." "They will not, my lord," she replied, though her throat tightened around the words. His eyes lingered for a fraction of a second, perhaps an attempt at kindness, perhaps simple habit, before he turned and walked toward the door. The scent of rain drifted in as the footman opened it for him, mingling with the fragrance of roses from the ballroom. Then he was gone, leaving behind a silence that seemed larger than the room itself. Her father approached, beaming with satisfaction. "You have done admirably, my dear. He is a man of fine breeding. In time, you will be grateful." "Yes, Papa," she said softly. Gratitude was a virtue she could learn. That night, in her chamber, she sat before the mirror long after the maid had left. The jewels at her throat glimmered faintly in the lamplight, reflections of promises she did not yet understand. She lifted one gloved hand, tracing the place where his fingers had briefly touched hers. It had been a gesture devoid of passion, yet she could not forget its coolness, its restraint. Something about it unsettled her, though she could not have said why. Across town, the Earl stood by his window overlooking the gaslit street. The night was clear, the storm that had once threatened gone without trace. In his hand he held the signed confirmation of their engagement, the ink dry and binding. He told himself that contentment lay in control, that the future was now secured, that there was comfort in certainty. Yet as he set the document aside, his gaze drifted to the window, to the quiet stars above London's rooftops, and he wondered again, why had he noticed the tremor in her voice when she said, "My lord?" He did not have an answer. He only knew that, for the first time in years, he had felt something stir beneath the armor of reason, a faint pulse of awareness that refused to be dismissed. He extinguished the lamp, determined to forget it, unaware that what he dismissed as trivial curiosity would one day become the undoing of his solitude. The morning of the wedding dawned pale and still, a thin mist veiling the rooftops of London, as if the city itself wished to soften the harshness of what was to come. Harrow House stood prepared in perfect order, its entrance lined with carriages, its halls scented faintly with lilies and beeswax. Within the private chapel, candles flickered in their silver holders, throwing wavering light across marble floors polished to a mirror's shine. The Earl of Harrow stood before the altar, every line of his posture composed, his expression serene in its detachment. He wore a coat of deep blue, and a white cravat fastened precisely beneath his chin, the picture of propriety. He had risen early, not from anticipation but from habit, the same disciplined restlessness that had governed every decision of his life. His thoughts moved in careful order: guest lists, settlements, the itinerary of the ceremony, anything but the idea of the woman who would soon walk toward him down the aisle. Eliza arrived exactly as the clock struck 11, her father escorting her with the pride of a man who had purchased his way into history. The gown she wore was of ivory satin trimmed with lace, elegant but unadorned, as if simplicity might disguise her trembling. Beneath the veil, her eyes searched the chapel and found the Earl waiting, tall and distant, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond her shoulder. The ceremony began, the vicar's voice rising and falling with the solemn rhythm of ritual. Words of promise and obedience echoed through the vaulted chamber. Eliza repeated them faithfully, though each phrase seemed to carry her further from the girl she had been only weeks before. When the Earl spoke his vows, his tone was steady, almost calm, but without inflection, as though he read from a ledger rather than pledging his life. When he placed the ring upon her finger, his hand brushed hers briefly, just enough for her to feel its coolness. She looked up, hoping to find a trace of warmth in his eyes, but he was already turning toward the officiant, the gesture complete, the duty fulfilled. The blessing followed, the signing of the register, the polite murmur of witnesses. Outside, the bells of St. George's rang across the square, scattering pigeons into the pale air. Guests smiled, offered congratulations, whispered observations of how well matched they appeared. To society, it was a perfect alliance. An earl restored to solvency, a merchant's daughter elevated to grace. To the bride and groom, it was the sealing of a transaction neither fully understood. The wedding breakfast passed in a blur of polite conversation and delicate courses served beneath gilt mirrors. The Earl spoke to her when necessary, inquiring whether she found the meal satisfactory, whether she was fatigued. She answered with practiced composure, her voice, even though her pulse raced with the strangeness of it all. Each moment felt curiously detached, as if she were observing her own life from a distance. When at last the guests departed and the carriages rolled away, silence settled over Harrow House like a closing door. The servants moved softly through the corridors, extinguishing candles, carrying away the remnants of celebration. Eliza stood in the drawing room, her bouquet wilted in her hands, uncertain whether to remain or retire. The Earl entered a moment later, pausing on the threshold as though even he were unsure how to proceed. "You may wish to rest," he said quietly. "The journey to the country will be early." "Yes, my lord." He inclined his head, courteous but remote. "The household will attend to your comfort. If you require anything, inform Mrs. Fletcher. She manages domestic arrangements." "Thank you, Counselor." There was a pause, long enough for the sound of the clock on the mantel to mark the seconds between them. She waited for him to say more, to offer even the smallest gesture of reassurance, but he merely bowed again and withdrew, leaving her to the stillness of the vast room. That night, Eliza stood at her window, the city fading into mist beyond the glass. Somewhere below, the last carriage clattered away down the cobbled street. She touched the ring upon her finger, the metal cold against her skin, and felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air. The moonlight caught on the polished floorboards, silvering the edges of her gown. She wondered whether he, in his own chamber, felt anything at all relief, satisfaction, regret. The thought was futile. She already knew the answer. In another part of the house, the Earl poured himself a final measure of brandy and stared into the fire. The ceremony had gone precisely as planned. The accounts would be settled, the creditors satisfied, the estate preserved. It was, by every rational measure, a success. Yet as the flames flickered, he found himself unsettled by an unexpected image, the look in her eyes when she had spoken her vows, a fragile steadiness that lingered in his mind. He set down the glass and dismissed the thought, telling himself it was only fatigue. By morning, they were on the road to Harrow Hall. The carriage wheels whispered over the frost-hardened ground, the countryside passing in muted tones of grey and silver. Eliza sat opposite her husband, gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the window. Neither spoke. The silence between them seemed to stretch with the miles, taut and unbroken. When at last the carriage turned into the long drive, she caught her first glimpse of the estate, a vast house of pale stone standing against a backdrop of bare trees and winter sky. It was grand, imposing, and strangely lifeless, as though even the landscape had forgotten how to breathe. The Earl assisted her from the carriage with formal care. "Welcome to Harrow Hall," he said. She curtsied slightly, her voice soft. "It is very fine. Dinner will be served at 7. If you prefer solitude, the blue drawing-room will be at your disposal." He offered his arm for the briefest moment, then withdrew it as though the gesture had exceeded its purpose. The great doors closed behind them, the echo resounding through the marble hall. The house was beautiful but cold. The fire in the hearth burned brightly, yet gave little warmth. That night, as the household settled into stillness, Eliza lay awake, listening to the wind trace the eaves. The sound reminded her of the sea she had glimpsed as a child, endless, restless, unknowable. She turned her face into the pillow and whispered a prayer she could scarcely voice, that in the emptiness of this new life she might find a reason to feel less alone. The first days at Harrow Hall unfolded in a hush that felt almost reverent, as though the house itself were listening. The great stone corridors absorbed every sound, swallowing footsteps and whispers alike until silence became a presence of its own. Servants moved through their duties with a kind of solemn precision, speaking only when necessary, their deference to the new mistress courteous but cautious. It was clear that they had been trained to mirror the reserve of their master. Eliza woke each morning to the distant chime of the stable bell and the faint echo of the household stirring below. The room assigned to her was spacious, its high windows draped in heavy curtains, its furniture gleaming from polish, its air faintly perfumed with lavender and dust. She would dress with her maid's quiet assistance, take breakfast alone in a sunlit room that never seemed to warm, then wander the galleries and corridors that stretched endlessly through the estate. The Earl was seldom present. He rose early, spent his days in the study or out among the tenants, and returned late in the evening. When they met at dinner, the conversation was brief, the pauses long. He asked if she was comfortable, if the servants had met her expectations. She replied that they had, and the exchange would dissolve into silence once more. One afternoon she ventured into the gardens. The air was cold but still, the sky a pale winter blue. Paths wound between skeletal trees, and the frozen fountains glimmered faintly in the light. She paused beside one of them, tracing the rim of its basin with a gloved finger. The water had long since stilled, a thin layer of ice sealing its surface, perfect and unbroken. She thought absurdly that it resembled her husband's composure, smooth, flawless, impenetrable. The housekeeper, Mrs. Fletcher, found her there and hesitated, clearly uncertain whether to interrupt. "My lady," she said at last, "would you care for tea in the morning room?" Eliza turned with a gentle smile. "Yes, thank you. And Mrs. Fletcher, how long have you served the family?" 30 years, my lady." The woman's expression softened slightly. "His lordship's mother was a gracious lady. The hall has not felt quite the same since her passing." "I imagine not," Eliza murmured. "It is a beautiful house, but rather lonely." Mrs. Fletcher hesitated again, then inclined her head. "We do our best to keep it well, my lady." Quote. When she was alone once more, Eliza stood listening to the wind sighing through the bare branches. She realized that in the days since her arrival, she had scarcely spoken more than a handful of sentences to another living soul. Her presence in the house seemed to alter nothing, She was like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, acknowledged, yet invisible. That evening, the Earl joined her for dinner as he always did, precisely at 7. The table was long enough to seat 20, but only 2 places were set, a single candelabrum illuminating the polished surface between them. The meal proceeded quietly. She attempted conversation, remarking on the gardens, the view from the upper gallery, but his replies were polite, perfunctory, and closed. When she mentioned the tenants, he nodded and said, "They are in better order than last year." When she spoke of the library, he said, "You are welcome to use it." Each sentence seemed to draw a line she was not to cross. Afterward, as she rose to leave, he stood and inclined his head. "Good night, Lady Harrow." "Good night, my lord." The sound of the door closing behind him felt louder than the words themselves. In the days that followed, she began to find small ways to fill the emptiness. She visited the kitchens, where the maids eyed her nervously until she praised the bread and asked their names. She walked the length of the picture gallery, learning the faces of generations long dead. In the evenings, she read by the fire until her eyes blurred, finding in books a company that did not demand silence. Once, while exploring a lesser-used wing of the house, she discovered a small sitting room overlooking the orchard. Dust lay thick upon the furniture, the curtains drawn and colorless. Yet when she opened the windows, the room filled with a sudden freshness that startled her. She ordered it cleaned, and soon it became her refuge, a place where she could breathe. One night, she heard the faint strains of a piano from somewhere below. The sound drifted through the corridors like a memory. She followed it, barefoot in her nightdress, until she reached the music room. There she found the Earl seated at the instrument, his head bent, his hands moving with unexpected grace over the keys. The melody was low and mournful, haunting in its simplicity. She stood unseen by the door, afraid to break the spell. When he finished, he closed the lid with deliberate care and sat motionless for a moment before rising. His face was turned toward the window, the moonlight outlining the tension in his features. Then he left, never noticing her presence. She waited until the echo of his footsteps faded, then approached the piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys, and she touched one softly. The note trembled in the air, faint and uncertain, like her own heart. The next morning, he said nothing of the music, and she did not ask. Yet from that night onward, she carried within her the sound of that melody, proof that somewhere beneath his composure there still lived a trace of feeling. It was a fragile thought, but it gave her strength. As the first weeks of marriage turned into months, the rhythm of their life settled into something like coexistence. They shared the same roof, the same meals, the same title, but their worlds remained separate. And yet, without quite knowing why, Eliza began to light a small fire in the morning room each day, though no one ever joined her there. It was a quiet act of defiance against the cold, a declaration that warmth, however small, still had a place at Harrow Hall. Spring came late to Harrow Hall, as though the season itself hesitated to cross its iron gates. The trees budded cautiously, the lawns softened under the first tentative rain, and the air carried a freshness the house had not known in years. With the thaw came subtle shifts, so gradual that no one could say precisely when they began. The fires in the grates burned longer. The servants, once muted in their duties, spoke in low, companionable tones. And in the morning room, sunlight began to fall upon vases of freshly cut flowers that no one remembered ordering. It was Eliza's doing, though she never sought acknowledgement. She spent her mornings walking through the house with quiet purpose, noting which rooms lay in shadow, which corners gathered dust. She requested that the windows be opened to let in air, that fresh linens replace those yellowed with disuse, that fires be lit in chambers long cold. When Mrs. Fletcher protested that his lordship preferred austerity, Eliza only smiled and said, "A little warmth will not offend him." Cuba. She brought small comforts to the servants as well, an extra loaf of bread for the kitchen, a pot of tea shared with the maids. At first they were wary, unsure how to respond to kindness from a mistress they scarcely knew. But kindness, once offered steadily, has a way of taking root. Laughter returned to the corridors, faint but genuine, like birdsong after a long silence. The Earl noticed none of it at first. He kept to his study and his ledgers, the familiar refuge of figures and correspondence. Yet one afternoon, while crossing the inner courtyard, he caught sight of his wife through the open door of the conservatory. She was kneeling beside a large potted fern, her sleeves rolled back, earth staining her gloves as she worked alongside the gardener. A shaft of light fell across her face, illuminating a stray curl that had escaped her bonnet. She was smiling, not the polite smile he had seen at dinner, but something freer, unguarded, alive. For a moment he stopped, his hand on the doorframe, uncertain why the sight unsettled him. There was a serenity about her that seemed foreign to the house he knew. When she laughed at something, the gardener said, the sound carried through the air and struck him with the faintest ache, as if he had glimpsed a secret world from which he was barred. He turned away before she could notice him and walked toward the stables, telling himself it was unimportant. Yet that evening, during dinner, the memory returned unbidden. He found himself studying her more closely, the gentleness of her voice, the way she spoke to the servants without condescension, the faint color that the country air had brought to her cheeks. She asked about the tenants, whether the spring floods had caused damage to the fields. He answered automatically, but the precision of her question caught his attention. "You have been speaking with the steward?" he asked. "I met him yesterday in the orchard," she said. "He mentioned that the river had risen near the boundary. It seemed wise to prepare." He looked at her a moment longer than courtesy required. Indeed, when the meal ended, he retreated to his study, though his mind lingered on the conversation. Her observation had been practical, even shrewd. It occurred to him that he had never truly listened to her before, only heard the surface of her words without considering the thought beneath them. The following morning, he passed the kitchen as the cook carried in baskets of produce from the market. Through the open door he glimpsed Eliza again, this time seated at the table with two maids, tasting the bread that had just come from the oven. She laughed softly when the younger maid burned her tongue on a crust too hot to eat, and the sound rippled through the room like sunlight breaking through cloud. The Earl paused, unseen, and felt an unfamiliar warmth stir within him. It was not admiration, not yet affection, only a gentle awareness of something missing in his own life that she seemed to possess effortlessly. Later that day, he summoned Mrs. Fletcher. "The household seems improved," he said, striving for neutrality. "Yes, my lord," she replied, her tone cautious but approving. "Her ladyship has a gift for bringing light into rooms one had forgotten." He dismissed her with a nod, but the words lingered. That evening, when he entered the dining room, he noticed that the candles burned brighter, that flowers adorned the table where none had been before. She was already seated, her posture graceful, her expression calm. "The house feels different," he remarked, almost without intending to. Her eyes lifted to his, surprised but steady. "I hope not unpleasantly so." "No," he said after a pause. "Not unpleasantly." It was the first conversation between them that did not end in silence. As days turned to weeks, he found his routine subtly altered. He walked through the gardens more often, perhaps by chance, perhaps in hope of crossing her path. Sometimes he did. Their exchanges were brief, a greeting, a remark about the weather, but they began to carry the faint rhythm of familiarity. Once, when a sudden gust of wind scattered the petals from a nearby rosebush, she laughed, and he felt an impulse to laugh with her. The sound that escaped him startled them both. That night, alone in his study, he considered how easily she had changed the texture of his days without demanding anything in return. The house, which had once mirrored his own restraint, now reflected her quiet persistence instead. He realized with unease that he had grown used to the sound of her footsteps in the corridor, to the faint scent of flowers that lingered where she passed. He told himself that such thoughts were harmless, that gratitude and admiration were not affection. Yet as he extinguished the candles and the darkness closed around him, he found that the silence no longer comforted him as it once had. It felt instead like an absence. The rain began before noon, soft at first, then heavier, until it drummed steadily upon the glass panes of Harrow Hall. The gardens blurred behind a curtain of silver, and the air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and roses beaten low by the storm. Within the house, fires burned brighter to chase the chill that crept through the corridors. The Earl remained in his study, surrounded by papers and correspondence. Though his attention wandered, numbers swam before his eyes, and the ink on the page blurred into meaningless shapes. The rain's persistence unsettled him, a reminder of things beyond his control. A light knock sounded at the door. He did not immediately answer, thinking it would be Mrs. Fletcher with the day's report. When the knock came again, he looked up, frowning slightly. "Enter," he said. The door opened, and Eliza appeared, carrying a silver tray with a teapot and 2 cups. The faint scent of bergamot drifted before her as she crossed the threshold. Her gown was pale grey, her hair loosely arranged, a few strands darkened by the rain she must have crossed between rooms. "I thought you might like some tea," she said softly. "The afternoon has turned rather cold." He rose from his chair, startled more by the sight of her than by the interruption itself. "Thank you," he said, his tone polite, uncertain. You need not have troubled yourself. It was no trouble. I was in the kitchen, and the fire there is warm. Cook insisted I bring a cup for myself as well. She placed the tray upon the desk, her movements precise yet unhurried. The steam from the pot curled upward, carrying a fragrance that softened the room. She poured for him first, then for herself, and for a moment neither spoke. The rhythm of the rain filled the silence. He watched as she stirred her tea, the delicate motion of the spoon against porcelain, oddly mesmerizing. When she looked up, their eyes met briefly, and she smiled, not the practiced smile of formality, but one touched by quiet amusement. "You have been shut away all morning," she said. "I wondered if the rain was keeping you captive." He hesitated, uncertain how to respond to such lightness. "One could say that," he replied at last. "The weather makes a convenient excuse for neglecting tedious correspondence." Her smile deepened. "Then I am glad of the rain. It seems to have done me a service." "Co." He found himself almost smiling in return. "You do not find it dreary?" "Not at all," she said. "Rain makes the world softer. It hides its imperfections. I think I like it better than Sunday." The remark was simple, yet it lingered. He realized with faint surprise that he wanted to know what other small things she liked, what thoughts lay behind her calm exterior. "You spend much time in the garden," he said. "Does it not frustrate you to see your work undone by weather?" She shook her head. "The garden forgives. It begins again as soon as the sun returns. That is what I admire most about it, its patience." He studied her face, the steadiness of her gaze, the intelligence that shone there. "Patience is not easily learned," he said quietly. "No," she agreed. "But it can be practiced even when it feels impossible." Something in her tone, gentle, knowing, struck him. He wondered whether she spoke only of the garden. For the first time, he felt a desire to ask what she thought of her new life, of him, of the cold marriage they inhabited. But the words would not form. Instead, he said, "Do you often bring tea to the study?" "Only today," she replied, and there was a trace of humor in her voice. "I thought perhaps you would welcome company, or at least warmth." "I do not often receive either," he said before he could stop himself. The admission surprised him. It sounded too honest, too exposed. She looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she said, "Warmth, once given, has a way of returning, even to the places that seem to resist it." He did not answer. The words lodged somewhere deep within him, unsettling in their truth. He gestured toward a chair. "Will you sit?" She obeyed with quiet grace, taking the seat near the fire. The light caught on the curve of her cheek, the faint sheen of her hair. For the first time, he saw not merely the wife he had chosen by necessity, but a woman possessed of thought, composure, and quiet strength. They spoke of ordinary things after that: the estate, the tenants, the market in the nearby town. Yet the conversation flowed with a natural ease that startled him. She spoke with intelligence and restraint, offering observations that revealed a mind far keener than he had imagined. When she mentioned an article she had read about crop rotation, he listened with genuine interest. Her reasoning was practical, her understanding precise. "You have read agricultural journals," he said, almost incredulous. "My father's trade required knowledge of many subjects," she replied. He believed his daughter should learn what she could, even if society thought it unnecessary. "That was wise," he said quietly. "Few fathers are so enlightened." The room seemed warmer than before. The rain still fell beyond the windows, but its sound no longer felt intrusive. Time stretched gently between them, neither hurried nor awkward. When she rose to leave, he stood as well, a courtesy he seldom remembered to perform. She hesitated at the door. "Thank you for the conversation," she said. "I should be the one to thank you," he replied. "The afternoon seems shorter for it." She inclined her head, a faint color rising in her cheeks. "Then I am glad." Quote. After she had gone, he remained where he was, staring at the empty chair beside the fire. The faint scent of tea lingered in the air. He sat down again, but the ledgers before him now seemed meaningless. The rain continued, steady and rhythmic, yet the house felt different, as if the sound itself had changed, softened somehow by her presence. That night, when he lay awake listening to the storm fade into quiet, he realized he had spent the entire evening thinking not of accounts or obligations, but of the way she had smiled when she spoke of the garden's patience. He told himself it was nothing, that gratitude and curiosity were harmless. Yet beneath those excuses stirred something deeper, fragile and new, the faint, impossible beginning of longing. The days after the rain carried a quiet gentleness, as though the house itself remembered warmth. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and wood smoke, and Harrow Hall, once so still, seemed to breathe again. The Earl noticed the change without quite admitting it. He rose earlier, walked longer through the grounds, and found his thoughts less confined to figures and accounts. He told himself that discipline required balance and that fresh air was good for the mind. Yet, more often than not, his steps led him to places where he might, by chance, encounter his wife. It was on one such morning that he found her in the servants' quarters. He had gone there to speak with the steward about repairs to the north fence, but stopped short in the doorway of the small sick room beyond the kitchen. Inside, the air was warm and faintly scented with camphor. A maid lay pale upon the cot, her face turned toward the wall. Beside her sat Eliza, sleeves rolled to the elbow, a basin of water and a folded cloth at hand. Her movements were calm, practiced, tender. The Earl hesitated, unseen for a moment. The scene was so unexpected that he simply watched. Eliza dipped the cloth into the water, wrung it gently, and laid it upon the girl's brow. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and soothing. "You will rest, Clara, and when you wake, you shall have broth. Mrs. Fletcher will see to it." Quote. The maid murmured something incoherent, and Eliza smiled faintly. "There now, no need for worry. The fever will break soon." When she turned to rinse the cloth, she noticed him standing in the doorway. For an instant, surprise flickered across her face, then composure returned. She rose and curtsied. "My lord, I did not hear you." "I was passing," he said, uncertain what he had meant to say beyond that. "Is she ill?" "A mild fever, nothing more," Eliza replied. "Mrs. Fletcher sent for the doctor, but I thought she might rest better with company until he arrives." He looked around the room, simple, small, far removed from the formality of the house above. "You are not required to do this," he said. "No," she agreed, but it seemed wrong not to. There was no reproach in her tone, yet the words struck him nonetheless. He stood awkwardly for a moment, the sound of the fire crackling between them. "Does she need anything?" Eliza glanced at the basin. "Only patience." He nodded and withdrew, though the image of her kneeling by the bed stayed with him as he walked down the corridor. The simplicity of her care unsettled him. It was not obligation that had drawn her there, but compassion. That evening, during dinner, he found himself studying her again, not as one studies an acquaintance, but as a man might study a puzzle whose meaning eludes him. "You have a way with people," he said suddenly. She looked up, surprised. "With people, my lord?" "Yes. The servants, the tenants. Even I have noticed their spirits improved since your arrival." Her smile was quiet. They only needed to be seen. He considered this. "And do you believe that is all anyone requires? To be seen?" "I think it is the beginning," she said gently. The conversation ended there, but her words lingered long after the table had been cleared. The following week, he rode out across the estate with his steward. The spring floods had left their mark upon the fields, yet the tenants greeted him with a warmth that surprised him. They spoke of Lady Harrow, how she had sent blankets when the roofs leaked, how she had walked the lane to visit a family whose child had been ill. Each story carried the same quiet admiration. The Earl listened, discomfort stirring beneath his pride. When had he last been spoken of with such affection? That night, when he returned to the hall, he found Eliza in the library. She sat near the fire with a book open upon her lap, her head bent, her face illuminated by the glow. He hesitated at the threshold, remembering the image of her tending the maid. Something within him shifted, a crack in the armor he had worn for so long. "You are reading late," he said, stepping inside. She looked up, smiling faintly. "I lost track of time. The book is difficult to set aside." He drew nearer, noticing the title, Milton. "Yes," she said, "I find his patience remarkable, to write of paradise and loss as if they were the same." "Perhaps they are," he murmured. She regarded him thoughtfully. "You sound as though you believe it." "Perhaps I do." He paused, then added, "You remind me of that patience." Her smile faltered, uncertain whether to take his words as compliment or confession. Before she could answer, he inclined his head and turned toward the shelves. "You have made good use of the library," he said lightly. "It was neglected." "Code." "Neglect can be mended," she said. He stopped, half smiling despite himself. "So it seems." When he left the room, he carried with him the faint scent of wood smoke and lavender, the memory of her steady gaze, and a growing unease that what had begun as curiosity was becoming something more dangerous. That night, he lay awake longer than usual, his thoughts circling the same quiet truth. He had built a life upon control, upon distance. Yet the sight of her kneeling beside a servant's bed had undone him more completely than any loss at cards or court could have done. It had shown him what strength truly was, not the absence of feeling, but its endurance. He rose before dawn, restless, and went to the window. The first light touched the edges of the gardens she had revived, glistening upon the wet leaves. Somewhere within the house, a door closed softly, and he knew it was her, beginning another day of quiet purpose. He stood there for a long time, listening to the silence she had somehow filled with meaning. The first true heat of summer came to Harrow Hall with deceptive gentleness. The days lengthened, the gardens bloomed in riotous colour, and the air shimmered faintly above the fields. Yet within the house, the warmth seemed to turn heavy, pressing upon the stone walls until even the servants moved more slowly. Eliza continued her quiet routines, writing letters to tenants, supervising repairs, visiting the village, but the work took its toll. She had never learned to rest easily, and when others spoke of her kindness, she answered only with a modest shake of her head. One afternoon, after a morning spent delivering baskets to the cottages, she returned pale and unsteady. Mrs. Fletcher, alarmed by her exhaustion, urged her to lie down, but Eliza insisted she was merely tired. By evening, a faint fever had taken hold. She dined alone in her chamber, unable to face the formality of the dining room, and assured her maid she would be better by morning. The Earl did not learn of her illness until the next day. He had spent the morning with his steward and returned in the early afternoon, dusty from the ride. Mrs. Fletcher met him at the door with a troubled expression. "Her ladyship is unwell, my lord," she said. "It seems only a chill, but she has refused to summon the physician." A chill. The words struck him with disproportionate force. "Send for Dr. Wilmot," he ordered. "At once." He did not wait for a reply, but went straight to the upper floor. The corridor outside her chamber was dim, the curtains drawn against the glare of the Sunday. He hesitated at the door, then knocked softly. There was no answer. He opened it and stepped inside. Eliza lay half-reclined among the pillows, her hair unbound, her face flushed with fever. The light from the window fell across her in narrow bands. A bowl of untouched broth sat on the table beside her, and the faint scent of lavender hung in the air. When she turned her head and saw him, surprise flickered in her eyes. "My lord," she whispered, her voice hoarse, "you should not trouble yourself." He moved closer to the bed, the composure he wore like armor slipping from him. "You are ill. Why was I not told? I asked them not to. It is nothing." He ignored her protest, resting a hand against the coverlet, as if anchoring himself. "You should have called the physician." "I did not wish to alarm you," she said softly. "It will pass." Her calmness unsettled him more than the fever itself. He could not bear the sight of her stillness, the fragile rise and fall of her breath. He wanted to speak, to offer reassurance, but no words came. At last he said only, "Dr. Wilmot is on his way." When the physician arrived, the Earl remained in the room, pacing silently while Wilmot examined her. The diagnosis was mild, a fever born of fatigue. Nothing grave, but the doctor's gentle reproach that she must rest struck him like an accusation. When Wilmot departed, promising to return the next day, the Earl lingered. "You heard what he said," he murmured. "You must rest." She smiled faintly. "I will. I promise." He hesitated, then sat beside the bed, unsure what else to do. For a long moment neither spoke. Outside, the hum of summer insects drifted through the open window. "Why do you do so much?" he asked at last, his voice low. "The tenants, the servants, this house, they would all manage well enough without your constant care." She turned her head upon the pillow, her eyes finding his. "Because I cannot bear to see things fall into neglect," she said simply. "A place, a person, it makes no difference. If I can mend what is broken, I must try." He looked away, ashamed of the sudden tightness in his throat. "And who mends you?" Her smile wavered. "No one needs to. I am not broken." He did not believe her. He wanted to tell her so, to confess that he had seen the weariness in her eyes, the quiet endurance she mistook for strength. But the words would not come. Instead, he reached for the glass of water on the table and offered it to her. Their fingers brushed, and the contact sent an unfamiliar ache through him. When she slept, he remained beside her, watching the faint movement of her breathing, the way the light from the window shifted across her face. Every so often he rose to adjust the curtain or the blanket, small gestures of care that felt both necessary and absurd. He had not realized until that moment how much space she had come to occupy in his life. As evening fell, Her fever deepened briefly, and she stirred restlessly, murmuring half-formed words. He bent closer, trying to understand, but her voice was faint. The only word he caught was his name spoken without title, stripped of formality, fragile and pleading. "Rest," he whispered, though his own heart raced. "I am here," she quieted, her breath evening again. He sat back, his hands trembling slightly. He could not recall the last time he had felt such helplessness, or such fear. The realization came upon him like a wave, fear not merely of illness or loss, but of emptiness, of the silence her absence would leave behind. When dawn broke, her fever had lessened. He had spent the night in the chair beside her bed, eyes half closed, listening to her breathing. When she woke, pale but lucid, he straightened at once. "You should not have stayed," she whispered. "Where else would I go?" She smiled weakly. "You have duties, my lord." He shook his head. "None more important than this." She studied him, bewildered by the tenderness in his tone. "You make it sound as though you care." Her words, meant as gentle humor, struck him with painful accuracy. He could not bring himself to answer. Instead, he took her hand carefully, as though afraid she might vanish, and held it until she drifted back into sleep. When Mrs. Fletcher entered later with fresh linens, she stopped short at the sight of him there, his head bowed, their hands still joined. She said nothing, only smiled faintly and withdrew. By afternoon, Eliza's fever had broken. The Earl returned to his study at last, but he could not concentrate. The ink dried on the pen before him, the papers lay untouched. His thoughts returned again and again to the image of her hand in his, to the sound of her voice murmuring his name. That night, he walked the length of the empty corridors, the echo of his footsteps following him like reproach. He paused outside her chamber door, listening for any sound, any sign of wakefulness. The silence within was steady, reassuring, and yet he could not bring himself to leave. He realized, with sudden clarity, that the fear he had felt was not of failure or disgrace. It was the fear of life returning to what it had been before she arrived. He turned away at last, whispering to the darkness what he could not yet say aloud. "Do not leave me. Cody." The fever broke with the pale light of morning, leaving behind the stillness that follows a long storm. Eliza woke slowly, her senses returning one by one. The faint scent of roses from the open window, the quiet tick of the clock upon the mantel, and most unexpected of all, the steady presence of someone sitting nearby. When her eyes opened fully, she found the Earl of Harrow in the chair beside her bed. His coat was unbuttoned, his hair disheveled, and fatigue shadowed his features. He looked nothing like the composed man she had known these past months. For a moment, she wondered whether she was dreaming. He rose when he saw her stir. "You are awake." His voice was roughened by weariness, yet it held a relief so raw that she scarcely recognized it. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, and he was already pouring water from the carafe. He held the glass to her lips, his hand steady despite the exhaustion written upon him. When she had taken a few sips, she sank back against the pillows. "I must have caused you trouble," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, you frightened me." The words fell quietly, but they filled the space between them. She stared at him, uncertain whether she had heard correctly. "Frightened you, my lord?" "Yes." He met her gaze, and for once there was no barrier in his eyes, no polished restraint. "I thought—" He stopped, as though the admission cost him something he could not easily give. "I thought you might leave me before I had learned how to keep you." She did not know how to answer. The honesty of it struck deeper than any declaration could have done. "You have kept me very well," she said softly. "I am still here." He drew a slow breath and turned slightly away, his hand tightening on the arm of the chair. "You should not have worked so hard. The estate, the tenants, it is not your burden to carry." Her smile was faint, tired but sincere. When one shares a home, one shares its burdens too. Something within him seemed to shift at those words. He sat again, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "You have done more for this house in a few months than I managed in years. I do not think I ever truly saw it until you came." "I did not see much of anything." She regarded him with quiet curiosity. "Why do you tell me this now?" "Because," he said slowly, "I am tired of silence. It has served me well in business, but poorly in life." The confession hung in the air, fragile and uncertain. She did not break it with gratitude or denial. Instead, she reached out a hand, the same hand he had held through the long night, and placed it lightly over his. "Then let us both learn to speak again." The contact startled him. Her touch was light, yet it burned through the last of his restraint. He turned his hand beneath hers and held it, not tightly, but with a reverence that felt new. "You should rest," he said at last, though his voice had softened. "I will, but only if you promise to rest as well. You look worse than I." That drew the faintest smile from him. "Perhaps I do." He remained with her through the morning, reading quietly from a volume she had left upon the bedside table. His voice, low and steady, filled the room with calm. When she drifted into sleep, he did not leave. The sunlight shifted slowly across the floor, touching first the foot of the bed, then her hand where it lay upon the coverlet. He sat unmoving, as though afraid that to stir might wake her. By afternoon she woke again, stronger. The physician came, pronounced her recovery assured, and departed with a look of satisfaction that the Earl scarcely acknowledged. When they were alone once more, Eliza said gently, "You need not stay, my lord. I am well now." He shook his head. "I will stay a little longer." She watched him in the fading light, his face thoughtful, the fire's glow reflected in his eyes. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It had changed, softened into something companionable. She felt the curious warmth of being seen, truly seen, for the first time since her arrival at Harrow Hall. In the days that followed, her strength returned, and so did his presence. Each afternoon he came to her room with a book or a letter, reading aloud or simply talking. They spoke of small things at first, the gardens, the weather, the gossip of the neighboring estates, but soon their conversations deepened. She told him of her childhood in her father's busy house, the scent of ink and parchment that clung to everything, the noise of commerce and laughter that had filled her days. He listened, genuinely listening, as if every detail mattered. One evening she asked, "And what of you, before all this?" He was silent for a moment. "I was a boy who wanted to be different from his father. He gambled away our fortune and died regretting nothing. I thought coldness would protect me from ruin. I was wrong." Eliza studied him, her expression gentle. "You have changed more than you think." "Have I?" "Yes," she said softly. "You stayed." "Oh, 'cause—" He looked at her then, truly looked, and for the first time he allowed himself to see not the dutiful wife of a transaction, but the woman who had, with quiet persistence, brought life back into his world. He rose and crossed to the window, needing the distance to steady himself. "You should know," he said after a moment, "that I have not been a kind husband." "Perhaps not a warm one," she agreed, "but kindness can take time." He turned back to her, a faint smile tugging at his mouth. "You find excuses for me too easily." "Not excuses," she said, "only reasons." The words, simple as they were, struck him deeply. He came back to her side and took her hand again, the gesture this time deliberate. "You have my gratitude," he said quietly. Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "And you have more than that, if you will see it." He could not answer. Gratitude was too small a word for what filled him. He only held her hand a little longer, until the last light of evening faded from the window, and the first stars appeared beyond the glass. That night, when he returned to his own chamber, he felt the house different around him. The silence no longer seemed empty but alive, carrying the faint echo of her voice, the warmth of her touch. He realized that the distance between them had begun to close, not through grand gestures, but through hours quietly shared. And as he extinguished the lamp, a single thought lingered, both terrifying and tender, that he had begun to need her, not as a duty, but as the heartbeat of his own existence. By the time summer ripened into the softer days of autumn, the quiet rhythm of life at Harrow Hall had changed in ways neither of them spoke of aloud. The windows were opened more often, laughter returned to the servants' quarters, and the once silent dining room now echoed with conversation. It was not constant, both were still creatures of restraint, but when they spoke, the words came easily. The chill that had settled between them for so many months had given way to a warmth that no longer felt accidental. Eliza had recovered fully, though the memory of her illness lingered in the Earl's mind like a warning. He found himself attentive to her comfort without thinking, noticing when the fire burned too low or when the draught through the corridor grew cold. Sometimes she would glance at him across the table and catch that watchfulness in his eyes, and both would look away, unsure what to do with the gentleness that had crept into their lives. In the early evenings, when the air outside was tinged with wood smoke, they began to spend time together in the library. The great room, once echoing and unused, became the heart of the house. She would sit near the hearth with her sewing or her books, and he would take the chair opposite, reading or simply listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing. Sometimes they spoke of the day's small events, sometimes of the past, and sometimes not at all. It was in those quiet hours that something unspoken began to grow between them, trust, perhaps, or the beginning of love's more patient kind. One evening, he entered the library to find her at the shelves, her fingertips trailing along the spines of the books. She turned when she heard him, smiling faintly. "I was looking for something to read. Do you have a recommendation, my lord?" He considered the question seriously, scanning the rows. "You have read most of the poetry, I think. Perhaps something different." He pulled down a small volume bound in dark leather and handed it to her. She glanced at the title and looked up, surprised. "A treatise on political reform? You think I should read this?" "I think you will not be bored by it," he said. She laughed softly, and the sound warmed the air. "You remember what I like better than I do myself." He did not tell her how often he thought of the things she had mentioned in passing, the book she admired, the garden she preferred, the music that calmed her. It astonished him how naturally those details had settled into his memory. She opened the book but did not read. "I would rather you choose something for us both. Will you read to me as you did when I was ill?" He hesitated only a moment before taking the volume she offered. It was a collection of essays by Addison, and his voice, low and steady, filled the room with measured rhythm. She listened intently, her gaze half lowered, her expression serene. When he paused, she said, "You have a fine voice for reading, my lord. One could almost forget it belongs to a man so often silent." He smiled, a real, unguarded smile. "Then I shall have to read more often." As he continued, the fire crackled softly, and the shadows deepened around them. When the hour grew late, she rose to pour tea. He watched her movements, graceful in their simplicity, and felt again that quiet ache in his chest. It was not passion, not yet, but something steadier and more profound, a gratitude for the peace she brought wherever she went. She handed him his cup, and their fingers brushed. This time, neither of them looked away. "You seem thoughtful," she said. "I was thinking," he replied slowly, "how strange it is that I once believed solitude was strength. It feels now like weakness, measured against what I might have missed." She met his gaze. "And what is it you fear missing?" He hesitated. "This, conversation, company, the sound of another voice at the end of the day." Her smile softened. "Then you shall not miss it again, if I can help it." The simple promise stirred him more than any declaration could have. He wanted to thank her, but found words insufficient. Instead, he lifted his cup slightly, as if in quiet salute. She returned the gesture, and for a moment they sat together, the firelight playing upon their faces, two souls who had lived too long in silence now learning the language of warmth. The weeks slipped by in that gentle way that marks a household at peace. They dined together each evening, and sometimes she teased him lightly about his seriousness. He learned to answer in kind, surprising her with a dry wit that revealed itself only now that he had begun to smile. The servants spoke of them with affection, marveling at how easily their voices carried down the hall now, how naturally they moved together. One night, as the wind rose outside, Eliza asked him about the history of Harrow Hall. He told her stories of his childhood, of his mother's laughter, of the long winters when he and his father had barely spoken. "I thought then," he said quietly, "that silence was dignity, but now I see it for what it was, fear." "Co." She reached out and touched his hand, the gesture unthinking, tender. "Fear can be unlearned." He turned his hand to clasp hers. "Perhaps you will teach me." She looked down at their joined hands, her voice a whisper. "I think we are teaching each other." Outside, rain began to fall again, gentle and rhythmic, tapping against the tall windows. He drew closer to the fire, still holding her hand. Neither spoke. The silence between them was no longer absence, but presence and understanding that needed no words. When at last they parted for the night, he walked her to the door of her chamber, something he had never done before. There he paused, uncertain whether to speak or bow. She looked up at him, her eyes bright in the candlelight. "Good night, my lord." "Good night," he said. His voice was lower than he intended, the words carrying a weight he did not try to hide. She smiled, and he stood there a moment after the door closed, listening to the soft sound of her steps within. When he turned away, he realized that the house, for the first time in his memory, felt alive from one end to the other. The echo of loneliness had been replaced by the faint heartbeat of something that might, if nurtured carefully, become love. That night, before he slept, he opened a blank page in his ledger and wrote only one line before closing it again. All things worth keeping grow slowly. It was late in the autumn when the past came quietly to reclaim its due. The leaves had turned to gold and crimson, and the air around Harrow Hall carried the faint chill of approaching winter. Inside, the warmth of the fires and the routine of companionship had woven a fragile peace, one that seemed strong enough to endure. Yet peace is most easily broken when one believes it secure. The Earl had been away for 2 days, called to the neighboring county on business. Eliza, accustomed now to his presence, found the silence of the house unsettling. She filled her hours with reading and correspondence, but the hours lengthened in his absence. On the second afternoon she wandered into the library, drawn by habit to the room that had become theirs. The fire was cold, and dust lay thinly upon the desk. She lit the candles, intending only to bring a touch of light to the gloom, and began to tidy the papers he had left behind. There was comfort in order, and she moved through the task with quiet care, stacking letters, aligning quills, folding stray sheets. Beneath a pile of documents near the back of the desk, her hand brushed against an envelope, unsealed and yellowed with age. The handwriting upon it was unmistakably his. Curiosity was her first impulse. Hesitation followed swiftly, yet something, a whisper of unease, perhaps compelled her to look closer. The letter was addressed not to her but to a solicitor, dated in the weeks before their marriage. The ink had faded slightly, but the words were clear enough to read. She read only the first few lines before her hand began to tremble. The phrases were businesslike, precise, and cold. The arrangement will resolve my debts and secure the estate. The lady's fortune is ample, her disposition modest. Affection is neither expected nor required. For a long time she stood motionless, the paper fluttering slightly between her fingers. The room seemed to tilt, the warmth she had kindled there draining away. She read the lines again, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words remained as stark as when they were written. This was not the language of duty softened by kindness, it was calculation, stripped bare. At last she folded the letter and placed it upon the desk, her movements deliberate, almost ritual. She felt neither anger nor tears, only the hollow ache of something breaking quietly within her. The affection that had grown between them, so fragile and new, now seemed built upon sand. She could not reconcile the man who had held her hand through illness, who read to her by the fire, with the one who had written those words. When the Earl returned that evening, the lamps were already lit. He found her in the drawing room, seated near the window. She rose as he entered, her expression calm but distant. "You have returned sooner than I expected," she said. "I concluded my business earlier than planned," he replied, smiling faintly. "It seems I am growing weary of company that is not yours." She did not return the smile. "I found a letter in your library." He stopped, confusion flickering across his features. "A letter? Addressed to your solicitor, dated before our marriage." Goat. For a moment he did not speak. Then comprehension struck, and with it a sharp, almost physical pain. "You read it?" "Yes." The silence that followed was suffocating. The fire hissed softly in the grate. He took a step toward her, then stopped. "Eliza, was it true?" Her voice was steady, though her hands clenched at her sides. "That you married me only to restore your fortune? That affection was neither expected nor required?" He closed his eyes briefly. "At the time, yes." Quote. The simplicity of the admission cut deeper than any denial could have. She turned away, walking toward the window. "Then all that has passed between us since all your kindness, your words, what are they?" "They are what I should have given you from the beginning," he said quietly. "They are what became true after I learned who you were." "After?" she repeated. "But not before. You cannot rewrite the beginning to suit the ending, my lord." Clote. Her calmness frightened him more than anger would have. He crossed the room and stood behind her, but did not dare reach for her. "If I could undo that letter, I would," he said. "If I could erase every cold word I ever wrote." "You cannot," she said, still facing the window. "Words do not vanish. They remain, even when we pretend to forget them." He drew a breath, searching for the right plea, but the gulf between them had widened beyond speech. "Will you forgive me?" She turned then, and he saw the shimmer of tears she had refused to shed. "I do not know," she said softly. "I only know that I cannot bear to see you now." She left the room before he could answer, her footsteps light and sure. He stood alone, the echo of the door closing behind her like a verdict. That night, the house felt colder than it had in months. He walked the corridors without purpose, each familiar room reminding him of what he had lost. When he passed the library, he saw the letter still upon the desk. He picked it up, staring at the lines that now felt like a stranger's handwriting. He tore it once, then again, until only fragments remained, and let them fall into the fire. The flames consumed them quickly, but the words lived on in his mind, seared there by regret. Sleep did not come. He sat in the dark until dawn, his thoughts circling the same question, whether the love he had finally learned too late could survive the truth that had preceded it. He knew only that if she chose to leave, the emptiness she left behind would not be silence, it would be absence in its truest form, the kind that no wealth or will could repair. Winter came and passed, slow and unkind. Snow gathered along the balustrades of Harrow Hall, muffling the world in white silence. The house no longer felt like a home, but a monument to everything unspoken. The Earl moved through its corridors like a ghost, his days consumed by futile attempts at routine. Eliza withdrew into quiet seclusion. She spoke when duty required, never with coldness, but with a distance that no apology could bridge. He wrote letters he never sent, apologies that dissolved beneath his pen before he could bear to sign them. The memory of her voice haunted the stillness, the echo of her laughter a sound he could not summon without pain. Each evening he waited for some chance encounter, a brief exchange in the hallway, the faint rustle of her skirts, but even these moments left him more bereft. When the first thaw came and the snow began to retreat from the gardens, he saw her outside for the first time in weeks. She walked alone among the bare trees, her cloak trailing through the damp earth, her face turned toward the weak spring Sunday. Something within him broke, then not with violence, but with clarity. He could not live any longer in a house where forgiveness had been left unasked, where love had been wounded by his own carelessness. He went to his study and opened the drawer that had remained locked since the night she found the letter. Inside lay the remnants of the contract that had begun their marriage, the same document that had bound their lives together for the sake of fortune. He stared at it for a long moment. The signatures faded, but legible. Then he gathered it in his hands and tore it slowly, once across and once again, until it lay in pieces on the desk. The sound was soft, final, like the exhale of an old regret. That evening, when the light began to fade, he sought her. He found her in the garden, standing beneath the great oak where the first buds of spring had begun to show. She turned when she heard his steps but did not move toward him. "I did not think you would come," she said quietly. "I could not stay away any longer." He stopped a few paces from her, his voice unsteady. "I have spent the winter trying to find words worthy of you. I have found none." She watched him in silence, her face calm but pale. The wind stirred a loose strand of hair across her cheek, and he resisted the urge to brush it away. "I wronged you," he continued. "From the first moment, from the day I signed that contract, I thought only of debts and preservation. I treated love as a luxury and you as a convenience. I see now that I traded my honor for survival and lost more than I gained." "You cannot change what is past," she said softly. "No," he agreed, "but I can choose what remains." He held out the torn pieces of the contract. "This bound us once in cold obligation. I no longer want that bond. I want the one we built afterward, the one you gave without ever asking for return." She looked at the paper, then at him. "And what would you ask of me now, my lord?" He took a step closer, the distance between them narrowing to breath. "Only that you might let me begin again, not as a man seeking forgiveness, but as one who has finally learned to love." For a long moment she said nothing. Then she reached out, taking the torn pieces from his hand. "You once told me that words do not vanish," she said. "You were right, but actions can replace them." She let the fragments drift from her fingers, scattering into the damp grass. "This will do." He felt the breath leave his body, as though the world itself had exhaled. "Can you forgive me?" he asked. Her gaze met his, steady and clear. "I can try, but I will not be the same woman you married. I have learned what silence costs. And I," he said, "have learned what love demands." Something in his tone, quiet, unguarded, moved her. The frost between them melted in the space of a heartbeat. She reached up, touching his face, and for the first time in their marriage, he leaned into the touch like a man who had found his way home. "Then let us begin again," she whispered. He bent his head, and their foreheads met, the gesture simple and reverent. "Eliza," he said, her name a confession and a vow. "I love you." It was not the grand declaration of a man redeemed, but the humble truth of one who had come through darkness into understanding. She smiled then, a smile that carried both sorrow and grace. "I know." The first drops of spring rain began to fall, soft and cool. She did not move away, nor did he. The garden around them shimmered with new life, the scent of wet earth rising like a benediction. In the days that followed, Harrow Hall awoke with them. The fires burned brighter, the servants laughed more freely, and the air filled once again with music. They moved through the house, not as strangers bound by duty, but as partners bound by choice. He listened when she spoke. She trusted when he promised. On the first truly warm day of spring, they walked together through the orchard, where the branches were heavy with blossom. He stopped beneath one tree and turned to her. "Do you regret any of it?" She thought for a moment. "No," she said finally. "If we had begun with love, we might never have learned its worth. We had to lose it to understand what it means to find it." He took her hand, bringing it to his lips. "Then let us never forget." They continued walking, the sound of their footsteps soft upon the grass, the sunlight filtering through the trees. Ahead of them, the path curved toward the river, bright with the reflection of sky. For the first time, he felt no need to look backward. That night, as they sat by the fire, she reached for his hand and said, "Do you still keep your ledgers, my lord?" "Not as I once did." "Then what will you record now?" He looked at her, smiling. "Only what is worth remembering." And so it was that the marriage once founded upon necessity became something enduring and whole. The man who had sought salvation through fortune found it instead through love. The woman who had entered a cold house of duty transformed it into a home. Together, they learned that redemption does not erase the past, it redeems it, line by line, through the grace of forgiveness freely given. In the quiet hours before sleep, when the fire dimmed and the world beyond their walls lay still, he would sometimes reach for her hand and feel her fingers twine with his. No grand words were needed then. The silence that had once divided them now bound them instead, filled with the unspoken certainty that love, though late in coming, had come to stay.